lone rancher for years, until giant Apache widow makes him serve her all day. Ethan Miller had lived alone for as long as anyone in the nearby town could remember. His ranch was tucked away in the far reaches of the Arizona plains, far from the bustle of towns and the chatter of neighbors. The wide-open landscape suited him perfectly. He liked the quiet, the endless horizon, and the way the wind whispered through the dry grass. For him, solitude was not loneliness, it was freedom. Every morning as the first light of dawn stretched across the dusty plains, Ethan would step outside his small wooden cabin, take a deep breath of the crisp morning air, and feel at home in the world he had built with his own 2 hands. The ranch itself was modest but well kept. A few dozen cattle wandered through the pastures, and a small herd of horses grazed near the corral. Ethan had built the fences himself, replacing worn boards and tightening the gates after storms. He spent countless hours tending to his animals, knowing each one by name and personality. There was Daisy, the gentle cow who always nudged him when she wanted water. Old Rusty, the horse with a white streak across his muzzle, would follow Ethan anywhere on the ranch. Each animal depended on him, and in turn he depended on the routine and comfort they brought to his days. Ethan's life followed a quiet rhythm. He rose before the sun, cooked a simple breakfast of eggs and coffee, and then headed out to check on his animals. He repaired fences, tended the land, and made sure his water sources were clean. Evenings were spent repairing tools, sharpening blades, or reading old books he had collected over the years. He rarely went into town, and when he did, it was only for essentials, seeds, feed, or supplies he could not make himself. He enjoyed watching other people interact, but he preferred the company of his own thoughts. Out here, away from prying eyes and unnecessary chatter, he could be himself. But living alone had its challenges. Harsh weather could strike without warning. Blistering heat in the summer, freezing nights in the winter, and sudden storms that could sweep through the plains. Every challenge fell squarely on Ethan's shoulders. If a fence collapsed or a calf fell sick, there was no one to share the burden. The isolation that brought him peace also demanded resilience and resourcefulness. Yet Ethan had grown stronger for it. He learned to fix what was broken, to mend what was torn, and to survive when nature tested him. It was a lonely life, yes, but it was also a life of mastery and independence. Despite his strength and self-reliance, Ethan was not without habits that made his days special. He had a small routine that brought him comfort and grounded him in the quiet world he loved. Each morning, he would sit by the corral with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the sun climb over the plains. He would greet his animals softly, speaking to them in low tones as he checked their health and moods. By mid-morning, he would tend to repairs or work the fields, and in the evenings, he would sit on the porch, listening to the calls of birds and the distant howl of coyotes. Sometimes he imagined stories about the people he might meet in town or the lives of travelers passing through, but those were fleeting thoughts, quickly replaced by the reality of his serene isolation. Over the years, Ethan had grown accustomed to his solitude. He had friends in town, people who would occasionally check on him or invite him to community events, but he rarely accepted. Life was simpler without complications. He liked the quiet mornings, the endless horizon, and the way the stars blanketed the sky at night without interference from city lights. His hands were rough from years of work, his clothes dusty and worn, and yet he took pride in every small accomplishment. He had carved out a life entirely his own, and it suited him perfectly, or so he thought. One late afternoon, as Ethan was repairing a section of fence near the edge of his property, he noticed something unusual on the horizon. A cloud of dust rose from the far distance, moving steadily toward him. At first, he assumed it was a traveler, or perhaps a herd of cattle, but as it came closer, he could make out the shape of a wagon. It was large and solidly built, pulled by a strong black horse. The figure atop the wagon was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with confidence. There was something commanding about the way the person sat, the way the dust seemed to part around them. Ethan narrowed his eyes, curiosity stirring in a part of him that rarely felt anything beyond the routine of his daily life. The figure on the wagon stopped near the edge of the plains, dismounted with ease, and began directing the horses and unloading supplies. Ethan observed quietly from a distance, unsure whether to approach. His instincts warned him that this was no ordinary neighbor. The person carried themselves with authority, their movements precise and purposeful. There was a presence about them that demanded attention, even from someone as self-sufficient and solitary as Ethan. He found himself drawn to the scene, a strange mix of wariness and fascination rising in his chest. As the wagon settled and the figure took stock of the supplies, Ethan decided to step closer. He dusted off his hands and walked toward the newcomer, careful not to startle them. The figure turned, and Ethan was struck by their size and strength. Tallulah Redfeather, a name he would soon learn, was a woman of imposing stature, with sharp eyes that seemed to measure every detail. Her hair, dark and glossy, framed a face that was both strong and kind. She moved with a grace that seemed at odds with her size, a confidence born of years of experience and independence. When she noticed Ethan, she raised an eyebrow, assessing him in return. "Hello," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the unexpected encounter. "I'm Ethan Miller. This is my ranch." "I'm Tallulah Redfeather. I just inherited the property next to yours. Thought I'd settle in." There was a pause, a moment of mutual appraisal. Ethan had spent years avoiding complications, and here was someone who seemed to bring an entirely new energy to his quiet world. Tallulah, for her part, seemed unfazed by the isolation of the plains. She handled her horse, inspected the wagon, and began arranging supplies with practiced hands. Ethan finally spoke again, his curiosity overcoming his usual caution. "You'll find it's not easy out here. The land can be harsh, and the work, well, it never ends." Tallulah's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "I can handle it," she said simply. There was no arrogance, only confidence, and a quiet command that made Ethan realize this was not someone to underestimate. Over the next few days, Ethan watched as Tallulah established herself on the land. She repaired fences, tended her animals, and organized her property with efficiency and determination. It was clear she was strong, capable, and unafraid of hard work. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of intrigue and perhaps a sense of unease. His routine, his carefully maintained solitude, was about to be challenged. By the end of that week, it was clear that Tallulah expected assistance. She approached Ethan one morning while he was feeding the cattle, her posture commanding yet calm. "I could use a hand," she said, her voice firm. "The work is more than I can manage alone. And I hear you know this land well." Ethan hesitated. Pride, habit, and a lifetime of independence warred with the practical reality of helping her. Yet as he looked at her, he sensed that refusing might not be an option. There was something unspoken in her presence, an expectation, a quiet insistence, that made saying no feel almost impossible. That night, Ethan sat on his porch, staring at the sunset and reflecting on the changes in his life. For years he had been content with solitude. For years he had managed everything alone. And for years he had believed that no one could ever disrupt the quiet rhythm he had built. Yet here was a force of nature in human form, someone strong, capable, and determined, ready to reshape his life in ways he had never imagined. Ethan sipped his coffee and let the cool evening wind wash over him. The plain stretched endlessly before him, the sky a canvas of oranges and purples, and somewhere nearby Tallulah's presence added a new dimension to the world he thought he knew. Change was coming. He could feel it in his bones, a shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable challenge to the life he had cherished. For the first time in years, Ethan Miller wondered what it would be like to share the plains with someone else, not as a neighbor, not as a visitor, but as someone whose strength and will could rival his own. And somewhere deep inside he felt a spark of anticipation, a quiet curiosity about the days to come and the unexpected journey that was about to begin. The morning after Ethan first met Tallulah, he awoke earlier than usual, his mind restless. The plains felt different now, as if the land itself had shifted with her arrival. He could still picture her, the way she moved with purpose, the steady confidence in her eyes, and the effortless way she handled her wagon and horses. Something about her presence unsettled him, yet he couldn't deny a strange curiosity. For the first time in years, Ethan felt that his quiet, ordered life might be about to change. By the time he stepped outside, the sun had just begun to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the fields. Ethan's cattle stirred and the horses in the corral neighed softly. He went through his usual morning routine, feeding the animals and checking the fences, but his thoughts kept drifting toward the new neighbor. A part of him wondered what her life had been like before coming here. She had the look of someone who had lived through challenges, who had handled loss and hardship, and yet she carried herself with undeniable strength and poise. As he was repairing a gate near the edge of his property, he heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, he saw Tallulah riding toward him on her black horse, her tall frame visible even from a distance. She dismounted with ease, her long boots clicking against the wooden fence, and he felt a subtle tension tighten in his chest. She didn't smile, yet her presence was commanding enough that he felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Morning, Ethan," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I hope I'm not disturbing your work." Ethan shook his head. "Not at all. Just checking the fence. The storms last week left a few boards loose." Tallulah's eyes swept across the fence line, noting the repairs he had already made. "I see. You know this land well." There was a pause as she studied him.
"I could use your help." Ethan felt a flicker of resistance.
He had lived independently for years, and the thought of assisting someone else, especially a stranger, felt foreign. Yet there was something in her tone, a quiet insistence, that left little room for refusal. He hesitated, searching for a polite way to decline, but the truth was, he knew she would persist. "What kind of help?" he asked cautiously. Tallulah pointed toward her property, a stretch of land just beyond his fence. "I need to fix my corral, move some supplies, and manage the animals. I can do most things myself, but it will take longer than I have if I'm alone." She was tall, strong, and confident, but there was no arrogance, just efficiency. It was clear she expected effort, not excuses. Reluctantly, he nodded. "All right. I'll help." The first task was moving hay bales from her wagon to the barn. Tallulah had stacked them neatly, but the wind had begun to pick up and a few had toppled over. Ethan lifted a heavy bale, setting it carefully in place, while Tallulah moved with the same energy, lifting and arranging with practiced skill. They worked side by side, the rhythm of labor filling the air, punctuated by the sounds of cattle, the creak of wood, and the occasional bark of a dog.
Ethan noticed her efficiency immediately.
She had a system for everything, how she lifted, stacked, and organized. There was a sense of authority in her actions that commanded attention without a word. He realized quickly that this was no ordinary neighbor asking for a favor. Tallulah expected full effort, and she expected it to be done right. By mid-morning, they had moved the hay and fixed the corral gates. Ethan was tired, but he felt a strange satisfaction. This was hard work, yes, but it was also purposeful, and Tallulah's presence made the tasks feel meaningful in a way that his usual routine never did. For years he had worked alone, yet somehow sharing the effort with someone else made the day feel different, more alive. Tallulah paused, wiping sweat from her brow. "Good work," she said simply. "But we're not done." Ethan frowned. He had thought the day's labor was nearly complete, but she was already surveying the next task, hauling water from the well to her livestock troughs. He followed her lead, filling buckets and carrying them across the dusty yard. Each trip tested his strength, and his muscles protested in ways they hadn't in years. Yet, despite the exhaustion, he found himself enjoying the challenge. Tallulah's quiet encouragement, the way she worked alongside him without condescension, made the hard labor feel almost rewarding. As the sun climbed higher, the pair worked in tandem. Tallulah's voice was calm and commanding, giving instructions with clarity. Ethan found himself listening closely, learning her methods, adjusting his own habits to match hers. She had a way of observing and guiding without criticism, and he began to realize that her leadership wasn't about control. It was about efficiency, respect, and getting things done right. During a brief break, they sat on the steps of her porch, sipping water and catching their breath. Ethan took the opportunity to observe her more closely. Her eyes, dark and steady, held stories he could only imagine. Her hands, calloused from years of labor, moved with precision, whether adjusting a harness or stacking hay. There was a quiet dignity in her presence. a sense of someone who had faced challenges and emerged stronger. Someone who could demand effort and respect without asking for permission. "You handle yourself well," she said after a moment, glancing at him. "Not many men would lift hay or fix fences without complaint." Ethan shrugged, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. "It's just work." "I'm used to it," Tallulah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good. You'll need that strength if you're going to help me regularly." Her words struck him more than he expected. Regularly. The thought of being called upon day after day was foreign, even intimidating. Yet at the same time he felt a curious pull, a sense that working with her, learning from her, and sharing the labor could be more than just obligation. It could be a new way of living, a challenge to his independence that he didn't know he needed. By afternoon, they had completed the major tasks for the day, but Tallulah wasn't finished. She had spotted a patch of weeds near the corral and wanted them cleared before the livestock damaged the fencing. Ethan groaned inwardly, but he didn't voice complaint. He had learned over the morning that resistance was futile. Tallulah's expectations were clear, and she would not settle for less than effort. As they worked, Ethan noticed subtle aspects of her character. She was patient but firm, observant but decisive. She didn't rush unnecessarily, yet she didn't waste a moment either. Her presence demanded attention, not through fear or arrogance, but through competence and quiet authority. Ethan realized that her strength wasn't just physical. It was a combination of intelligence, experience, and self-assurance that made her nearly impossible to ignore. The day wore on, and the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Ethan's arms ached, his shirt was drenched in sweat, and his boots were coated in dust. Yet, as he looked at the completed tasks, the fixed fences, stacked hay, watered livestock, and cleared weeds, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Working alongside Tallulah had pushed him beyond his usual limits, and in doing so had awakened a part of him he hadn't felt in years, a feeling of shared purpose and challenge. Tallulah surveyed the work with a critical eye, then nodded. "Death to the turncoat!" "You've earned your rest for the evening." Ethan felt relief, but also a strange disappointment. The day's labor had been hard, yes, but it had also been fulfilling in a way that solitude never provided. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that there could be value in shared effort, not just efficiency, but the human connection that comes from working together toward a common goal. As they parted ways for the evening, Tallulah mounted her horse and gave him a final glance. "Tomorrow, we start early. There's more to do." Ethan watched her ride away, the wind tugging at her hair, the dust trailing behind her like a banner. He felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. His life of quiet solitude was no longer the only option. Change was coming, whether he liked it or not. And despite the uncertainty, he felt the spark of curiosity. What could life be like if he allowed himself to step into this new routine, to work alongside someone as strong and capable as Tallulah? That night, as he sat on his porch watching the stars, Ethan reflected on the day. The plain seemed larger, more vibrant, filled with possibilities he hadn't considered. Tallulah had entered his life with quiet authority, reshaping his routine and challenging his independence. And although he had resisted at first, he found himself secretly looking forward to the days to come. For the first time in years, Ethan Miller felt the stirrings of change, and with it, a strange but undeniable sense of excitement. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of roosters crowing and the soft rustle of wind through the prairie grass. The sun had barely begun to rise, and already the world outside his cabin was alive with motion. He stretched, rubbed his stiff shoulders, and remembered Tallulah's words from the night before. "Tomorrow, we start early. There's more to do." He felt a pang of reluctance. His body ached from the previous day's work, and a part of him longed for the familiar solitude of his routine. Yet another part of him felt an unspoken pull, a curiosity about what challenges awaited, and a strange anticipation about working alongside Tallulah again. By the time he stepped outside, Tallulah was already in motion. She was inspecting her property, checking the horses and making a mental list of the day's tasks. Her black horse stood patiently beside her, shifting weight from one hoof to another, while she carried herself with calm authority. Ethan paused for a moment, watching her. Her presence had a way of commanding attention without a single word. Even after a full day of labor yesterday, he still found himself both intimidated and impressed by her. "Morning," she called, noticing him at the edge of the corral. "I hope you slept well." "There's much to do today," Ethan nodded, swallowing his pride. "I'll manage." Tallulah gave a small, approving nod and then began detailing the day's work. There were fences to repair, the barn to clean, water troughs to refill, and hay to distribute to the cattle and horses. She spoke with precision and calm, and Ethan realized that resisting or arguing would be pointless. Her expectations were clear, and she anticipated full effort. The day began with the fences. Tallulah demonstrated how to repair broken sections efficiently, and Ethan followed her lead, learning the rhythm of her work. She worked tirelessly, lifting, hammering, and organizing with a focus that left no room for error. Ethan found himself both exhausted and fascinated. He had spent years working alone, but the energy she brought to each task made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt for decades. By mid-morning, they had completed the fence repairs, and Tallulah moved on to the barn. Ethan followed, hauling straw, cleaning stalls, and feeding the animals. It was grueling work, and his muscles screamed with every movement. Yet Tallulah's calm efficiency kept the pace steady, and her occasional words of encouragement reminded him that effort mattered more than complaints. She never belittled him or demanded perfection, but her quiet authority left no room for laziness. As they worked, Ethan found himself observing her closely. Tallulah's hands were strong but careful, her movements precise and practiced. She had an almost uncanny ability to assess problems and solve them quickly. Her knowledge of animals and land management was deep, and it became clear that her presence here was not just as a neighbor but as someone who understood the harsh realities of life on the plains. He realized that she was not commanding him out of necessity alone. She expected effort because she valued it, because she respected competence and diligence, and because she wanted things done correctly. Despite his initial reluctance, Ethan began to notice something surprising. The work, though exhausting, was becoming almost satisfying. It was more than physical labor. It was a shared effort, a rhythm of cooperation that neither of them had spoken about but both understood. Tallulah's presence turned mundane tasks into challenges to be met together. Each bucket of water hauled, each gate repaired, each bale of hay stacked was a small victory. He realized that her insistence on effort was not a burden but an invitation to learn, to grow, and to be part of something larger than his solitary existence. By midday, the sun had climbed high, and the heat was relentless. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow and adjusted his hat, feeling every ounce of fatigue from the morning's work. Yet he also felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just maintaining his own ranch. He was part of a partnership, however unconventional. The realization was both thrilling and intimidating. For years, he had defined himself by his independence, by his ability to manage alone. Now he was discovering that relying on, or at least cooperating with, another person could be just as meaningful. Tallulah paused, leaning on a shovel, and gave him a measured look. "You're learning quickly," she said. "Most people would have given up by now." Ethan shrugged, feeling a mix of pride and fatigue. "It's hard work, but I'm used to it." "I've lived on this land a long time," she nodded, as if acknowledging something unspoken. "Good. You'll need endurance. The work doesn't stop because the sun rises. It doesn't wait for tired men." Ethan swallowed, realizing that this was only the beginning. Tallulah's expectations were steady, unrelenting, and yet fair. She pushed him, but never unnecessarily. He felt a strange combination of pressure and respect, exhaustion and admiration. For the first time in years, he was being challenged, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The afternoon was dedicated to water management and tending the livestock. Ethan carried buckets to the troughs, filled water tanks, and ensured the animals were well fed. Tallulah worked beside him, occasionally offering tips on efficiency and technique. He found himself paying close attention, realizing that her methods were both practical and ingenious. She had developed a way of working that minimized wasted effort and maximized results. It was clear that her strength wasn't just in her physical power, but in her intelligence and experience. By late afternoon, the labor had taken a toll. Ethan's muscles ached, his clothes were soaked in sweat, and dust clung to every exposed surface. Yet, despite the physical strain, he felt a sense of pride. The ranch was in better condition than it had been in months. The fences were repaired, the barn was clean, and the animals were thriving. He looked at Tallulah, who was surveying the land with a critical but approving eye, and felt a deep respect for her. Tallulah noticed his gaze and smiled faintly. "You're getting the hang of it," she said. "It will get easier as you adjust, and the land will seem less daunting." Ethan nodded, feeling both challenged and inspired. He realized that her presence had changed his perception of the ranch, of labor, and of life itself. What had once been a routine, solitary existence was now a shared effort, filled with lessons, challenges, and unexpected satisfaction. He understood that Tallulah's insistence on diligence and endurance was not meant to punish him. It was meant to guide him, to push him beyond his limits, and to make him a better rancher, a stronger man, and perhaps a more connected human being. As the sun began to set, painting the plains in hues of gold and crimson, Tallulah finally called a halt to the day's work. Ethan collapsed onto a hay bale, exhausted but oddly content. Tallulah joined him, stretching her arms and looking out over the land. There was a quiet moment between them, a shared understanding that words were not necessary. The work had spoken for itself. "You did well today," Tallulah said softly, breaking the silence. "Not everyone could keep up with the pace. You have strength, skill, and determination." "I respect that." Ethan felt a flush of pride. Her approval mattered more than he expected. "Thank you," he replied. "It's different working with someone else. Hard, but satisfying." Tallulah nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, life on the plains is hard. It demands effort, patience, and resilience. Working together makes it possible to endure and even to thrive." As Ethan walked back to his cabin that evening, every step felt heavier, but his mind was alive with reflection. He realized that the days ahead would be challenging, filled with labor and perhaps discomfort, but they would also be meaningful. He understood that Tallulah was not just a demanding neighbor. She was a force of nature, someone whose presence would reshape his routine, test his limits, and perhaps teach him lessons he had long forgotten. By the time he reached his porch, the stars had begun to appear, twinkling in the clear desert sky. He sat down, letting the quiet of the plains wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of anticipation about tomorrow, about the labor, the learning, and the strange companionship that had begun to form. Tallulah had arrived in his life with quiet authority, and while it had been exhausting, it had also been invigorating. Ethan Miller realized that his life was changing. The solitude he had cherished for so long was giving way to a partnership, and while it was demanding and sometimes uncomfortable, it was also enriching. He had entered her world reluctantly, but he was beginning to understand that working alongside Tallulah could open doors to experiences, growth, and understanding he had never imagined. The plains, once a quiet refuge, were now alive with new energy, challenge, and possibility. And as the night settled in, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He would rise early again tomorrow, ready to face whatever Tallulah had planned, ready to work, learn, and grow. For the first time in a long time, the life he had built alone was no longer enough. Change had arrived, and with it the chance to become more than he had ever been. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan Miller found himself slowly adjusting to a life he had never imagined. The routines that once belonged solely to him, the feeding of cattle, repairing fences, maintaining the barn, were now shared with Tallulah Redfeather. What had begun as reluctant servitude gradually transformed into a rhythm of cooperation. At first, Ethan had resisted, clinging to his independence, but over time he discovered a strange satisfaction in working alongside someone whose strength and skills matched his own. Tallulah's presence was challenging, yes, but it also brought a new energy to the plains, a vitality that Ethan had not realized he was missing. Their days were long and demanding. They rose with the sun, tending first to the livestock and then moving to chores that required steady hands and careful planning. Ethan carried buckets of water, repaired fences, and organized supplies, while Tallulah oversaw the work, lending a hand wherever needed. She had a methodical way of managing the land that made even the hardest labor feel purposeful. Ethan began to notice patterns in her approach, how she prioritized tasks, how she assessed problems before acting, and how she solved challenges with a calm decisiveness that left little room for error. At first, he had felt a tension in her presence, a sense that he was being judged, measured, and tested. But gradually, that tension transformed into something else: respect. Tallulah had a way of acknowledging effort, of appreciating skill without unnecessary words. She rarely offered praise, but when she did, it carried weight. One afternoon, after hours of repairing a damaged section of fence and organizing the hay in the barn, she finally nodded toward him and said simply, "Well done today." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him. It was a small acknowledgement, but coming from her, it felt significant. Ethan also began to observe subtle aspects of Tallulah's personality that intrigued him. She had a quiet humor that revealed itself in small gestures. A smirk when a stubborn horse resisted her guidance, a teasing remark when Ethan struggled with a particularly heavy bale of hay. She shared stories of her late husband, not in a way that sought sympathy, but as lessons learned and wisdom earned. She spoke of her childhood, of growing up on the plains, and of the challenges she had faced as an Apache woman managing land and livestock in a world that often underestimated her strength. Ethan listened, fascinated, realizing that her toughness was rooted not only in physical strength but in a lifetime of resilience and experience. For his part, Ethan began to open up as well. He shared fragments of his own past, his years of solitude, the hardships of maintaining the ranch alone, and the sense of freedom he had cherished in isolation. Tallulah listened patiently, occasionally nodding, sometimes asking a question that made him reflect deeper on his choices. He found that sharing these parts of himself which he had guarded for so long was not uncomfortable. Tallulah's presence created a space where vulnerability felt safe, and over time, this mutual openness deepened their connection. One morning, while repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a sudden storm, Tallulah watched Ethan struggle with a particularly heavy post. "Here, let me help you with that," she said. Together they lifted the post, adjusting it until it fit perfectly into place. Ethan realized, with a mixture of relief and admiration, how natural it was to work alongside her. There was no awkwardness, no sense of competition, only a shared purpose. He began to understand that their partnership was not just about labor. It was about trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. Meals became moments of quiet connection. After a long day of work, they would sit on the porch of Tallulah's cabin or under the shade of an old oak tree, eating simple food prepared from the produce of the land. Sometimes they spoke of practical matters, upcoming tasks, weather forecasts, livestock care, but other times their conversations drifted to dreams, memories, and observations of the world around them. Ethan found himself enjoying these exchanges, realizing that companionship did not have to be complicated to be meaningful. There were moments of humor as well, often arising from the quirks of the animals or the unpredictability of the land. One afternoon, a calf had escaped its pen and wandered into a patch of thorny bushes. Ethan and Tallulah spent nearly an hour coaxing it back, laughing at the animal's stubbornness and their own clumsy attempts to guide it. Such moments reminded Ethan that life on the plains, though hard, could also be filled with joy, laughter, and shared accomplishment. Tallulah's laughter, clear and unrestrained, became something he looked forward to hearing. As weeks passed, Ethan noticed changes within himself. He was stronger, more attentive, and more aware of the subtleties of the land. He had always been competent, but under Tallulah's guidance he had become more efficient, more precise, and more confident in his abilities. Her expectations pushed him beyond what he thought were his limits, and in doing so he discovered a deeper sense of satisfaction in his work. For the first time in years, his labor felt connected to something larger than himself. Tallulah noticed the changes as well. She observed how Ethan adapted to the work, how he anticipated needs, and how he began to contribute ideas for solving challenges around the ranch. She respected his independence and skill, but she also recognized that he was capable of more when guided and supported. Their dynamic shifted from mere labor and instruction to a partnership based on mutual respect and recognition of each other's strengths. There were also quiet moments of reflection. Ethan would sometimes pause during the workday, watching Tallulah handle her tasks with grace and strength, and marvel at how much she had endured in her life. He began to understand that her imposing presence and command over the land were not just traits of personality, they were the result of resilience, experience, and wisdom earned over years of challenge. This understanding deepened his respect and admiration for her, and he found himself learning not just practical skills, but life lessons as well. One evening, after a particularly long day of labor, they sat together watching the sun set over the plains. The sky was a canvas of gold, orange, and deep purple, and the land stretched endlessly before them. Ethan felt a sense of calm he had not known before. "I never thought I'd enjoy working like this," he said quietly.
I mean, it's hard and it's tiring, but I feel
"Better somehow?" Tallulah looked at him, her expression softening.
it's different when you share the effort, she replied. The land is demanding, but you don't have to face it alone.
There's strength in cooperation, even for those who value independence. Dote interrupted from the truth in her words. The days of complete solitude had taught him resilience and self-reliance, but Tallulah had shown him another kind of strength, the strength that comes from trust, mutual respect, and shared labor. He realized that independence and cooperation were not opposites. Rather, they could coexist, creating a life richer than either could provide alone. In the evenings, as they prepared for the next day, their conversations often turned to plans, goals, and small improvements around the ranch. Ethan began to contribute more ideas, suggesting ways to optimize work or improve the condition of the land. Tallulah listened attentively, considering his insights and occasionally adopting his suggestions. The mutual exchange of knowledge strengthened their bond, turning what had begun as reluctant servitude into a meaningful and rewarding partnership. Through it all, Ethan discovered another surprising realization. He was enjoying Tallulah's presence, not just her skills and guidance, but her character, humor, and resilience. He appreciated the quiet strength she displayed, the way she balanced authority with fairness, and the way she treated him as a capable partner rather than a subordinate. Their relationship was evolving, subtle yet significant, grounded in shared effort, respect, and understanding. By the end of the 4th week, Ethan found himself looking forward to each day. The labor was still demanding, the sun still hot, and the plains still vast and challenging, but the experience was no longer daunting. He felt a sense of purpose, pride, and connection that he had not known in years of solitude. Tallulah's presence had transformed his routine, reshaped his perspective, and awakened a part of him that had long been dormant. One late afternoon, as they finished repairing the last section of a broken fence, Tallulah turned to him.
You've done well, she said. Better than I expected. You're learning, adapting, and contributing in ways that make the land stronger, and yourself too.
Ethan felt a deep warmth at her words. "Thank you," he replied.
I didn't realize how much I could grow just by working with someone.
Tallulah smiled faintly, a rare softness in her usually commanding expression.
Growth often comes from challenge, she said.
And sometimes from companionship. You've shown patience, resilience, and skill.
That's why you're capable of more than you realize.
As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Ethan sat on the porch of his cabin, reflecting on the past month. He had entered Tallulah's world reluctantly, resisting change and clinging to his independence. Yet through shared labor, mutual respect, and quiet companionship, he had discovered a life richer and more rewarding than he could have imagined. He understood that the bond forming between them was not built on obligation, but on trust, admiration, and the unspoken understanding that they were stronger together than apart. And for the first time in years, Ethan Miller felt a deep sense of belonging, not just to the land he had always cherished,
but to the partnership he had begun to form with Tallulah Redfeather. The plains, once a symbol of solitude, had become a canvas for growth, respect, and shared purpose. And as the stars appeared overhead, he knew that their journey was far from over, but he was ready to face it, side by side with someone who had changed his world forever. Weeks turned into months, and the harsh Arizona plains had begun to feel less lonely and more alive to Ethan Miller. What had started as reluctant servitude had evolved into a partnership he had never imagined for himself. Every day was still filled with hard work, from repairing fences and tending livestock to hauling water and organizing supplies, but the effort no longer felt burdensome. Working alongside Tallulah Redfeather had reshaped his understanding of strength, independence, and companionship. He realized that there was a satisfaction in shared labor that solitude alone could never provide. The mornings were their time of preparation and planning. Ethan and Tallulah rose at first light, moving quietly around the ranch as the world awakened.
The cattle stirred, the horses nickered, and the wind whispered across the plains. Together they checked the fences, ensured the animals were fed, and inspected the land for damage or opportunities for improvement.
Tallulah had a keen eye for detail, and Ethan had learned to anticipate her needs, moving with her rhythm and matching her energy. Their work was a dance of sorts, each step coordinated, each action purposeful.
Over time, Ethan noticed how much he had grown under her guidance. He was stronger, more observant, and more capable than he had been when living alone. The land no longer intimidated him, nor did the task seem insurmountable.
Tallulah had not only taught him practical skills, how to repair a broken fence quickly, how to manage water efficiently, how to handle stubborn livestock, but she had also taught him patience, strategy, and resilience. The lessons extended beyond the ranch, shaping the way he approached life itself. Tallulah, too, had grown to rely on Ethan in ways that surprised him. She respected his work ethic, his attention to detail, and the steady calm he brought to the ranch.
There were times when she trusted him to make decisions on his own, knowing he had learned to think through problems logically and act decisively.
Their partnership had reached a balance. She guided and directed when necessary, but she also allowed space for him to contribute his own ideas and skills. Ethan felt a sense of pride and purpose he had not experienced in years of solitary labor.
Life on the plains was not without its challenges. Summer heat burned down relentlessly, sudden storms tested their fences and water systems, and livestock occasionally fell ill or wandered off.
Yet together, they faced these challenges with determination and cooperation. Ethan marveled at Tallulah's ability to remain calm and focused under pressure, and he felt a growing sense of confidence in himself as he tackled obstacles alongside her. The once overwhelming tasks now felt manageable, and even rewarding because they were shared. Beyond the labor, a deeper connection began to grow between them. They shared stories of the past, memories of loss, and reflections on life. Ethan recounted years of solitude, the routines he had cherished, and the moments of quiet triumph when he solved a problem on the ranch alone. Tallulah shared tales of her late husband, her childhood, and the lessons she had learned as a strong Apache woman managing her land. These conversations were gentle, sometimes humorous, sometimes somber, but always sincere. Through them, Ethan realized that companionship was not just about sharing labor. It was about trust, understanding, and mutual respect. One particularly hot afternoon, a sudden gust of wind carried dust across the fields, scattering hay and causing the livestock to become restless. Ethan and Tallulah worked together to calm the animals, securing gates and guiding the cattle back to their pens. The work was exhausting, yet there was a shared sense of accomplishment when everything was finally settled. Tallulah glanced at Ethan, a hint of a smile on her face. "We make a good team," she said simply. Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years.
"I didn't think I'd enjoy it this much," he admitted. "But I like working with you. It feels right." Tallulah's smile widened slightly. "It's more than right. It's necessary. The land demands it, and life is better when challenges are faced together." Their days continued in this rhythm: work, problem-solving, shared meals, and quiet moments of reflection.
Ethan found himself appreciating the little things he had once taken for granted: the smell of fresh hay, the sound of water in the trough, the pattern of stars in the night sky. But now these moments were richer because they were shared with Tallulah. There was laughter as they recounted a stubborn calf's antics or a wayward fence board. There were comfortable silences as they rested under the shade of an old tree, watching the horizon stretch endlessly before them.
As time passed, Ethan realized that he had come to depend on her presence, not out of necessity, but out of choice. Tallulah's guidance, strength, and wisdom had become an integral part of his life, shaping his days and giving him a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer viewed their partnership as servitude, but as collaboration. He felt pride in his work, satisfaction in shared accomplishments, and respect for the woman who had changed his life so profoundly. One evening, after a long day repairing a section of fence damaged by a summer storm, they sat together on the porch of Tallulah's cabin, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sky was a brilliant mix of oranges and purples, and the plains stretched endlessly before them. Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. The life he had built alone had been meaningful, but the life he shared with Tallulah felt complete. "You've done well," Tallulah said quietly, breaking the silence. "Better than I could have expected. You've adapted, learned, and grown. The ranch and you are stronger for it." Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I didn't think I could handle it at first," he admitted. "But with your guidance, it's been more than I imagined. I've learned more than I thought possible." Tallulah nodded, her eyes softening. "Growth comes from challenge, and strength comes from shared effort. You've shown both. That's why this partnership works." Their conversations that evening turned to plans for the future. They discussed improving water management, expanding pastures, planting crops, and enhancing the barns. Ethan offered ideas, which Tallulah considered carefully, sometimes adopting them, sometimes offering alternative solutions. There was mutual respect in every decision, and a sense of shared ownership of the land and the work. The partnership had become seamless, the rhythm of their days natural and satisfying. Evenings were their time to relax and reflect. They would sit outside, sipping water or coffee, watching the sky change colors as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sometimes they would talk about the stars, the wind, and the patterns of the plains. Other times they would remain silent, simply enjoying the presence of one another and the quiet beauty of the land. Ethan had never experienced such peace, an active, engaged peace that came not from isolation but from shared effort and understanding. Ethan also noticed how much he had grown as a person. He was more patient, more observant, and more resilient. He had learned to handle challenges calmly, to anticipate problems before they became emergencies, and to approach life with a balance of independence and cooperation. Tallulah's guidance had reshaped his understanding of strength and leadership, and he found himself inspired to do better, not just for himself, but for the partnership they had built. Over time, the bond between Ethan and Tallulah deepened. They celebrated small victories together: the birth of a healthy calf, a repaired barn roof, a successfully planted crop. They shared in the occasional frustrations, the loss of a fence board in a storm, a sick animal, or a stubborn task that took longer than expected. Through it all, they supported one another, learning from each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. The plains no longer felt empty to Ethan. He realized that the vast open land was richer, more vibrant, and more alive because it was shared. The animals, the fields, and even the skies seemed to hold more meaning when experienced alongside someone who respected, guided, and inspired him. Tallulah had transformed his life not by replacing his independence, but by enhancing it through partnership, trust, and shared effort. One bright morning, after weeks of steady work, Ethan paused at the edge of the corral, looking out over the land. The fences were strong, the barns were in good condition, and the livestock were healthy. The ranch was thriving in a way it had not before. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just in the work itself, but in the life he now shared with Tallulah. The plains were no longer a place of solitude, but a place of connection, growth, and fulfillment. Tallulah joined him, her presence steady and calming. She looked out over the horizon, then turned to him. "We've done well," she said. "The land is thriving. And so are we. Ethan nodded, smiling. Yes. I've learned so much, and I feel complete, somehow. I didn't realize life could be like this. Hard, yes, but meaningful and full. Tallulah smiled, a rare warmth in her expression. That's what happens when effort, respect, and understanding come together. You've embraced the challenge, grown stronger, and become part of something greater. And that is the reward. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the plains, Ethan Miller realized that he had found harmony. The days of solitary labor were behind him.
In their place was a life rich with purpose, respect, and shared effort. He had not only learned the value of partnership, but had discovered that even a life built on independence could be enriched by trust, guidance, and companionship. Together, Ethan and Tallulah continued to work, plan, and live on the plains. The ranch flourished, the animals thrived, and the land became a testament to their partnership. The lessons they had learned about strength, respect, cooperation, and resilience remained with them, shaping every task, every decision, and every shared moment. And in the quiet of the evening, as the stars blanketed the sky and the plains stretched endlessly before them, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He was no longer alone.
And life had never felt so full